Hey, Larken Rose here. With all the lunacy going on in the US, I'm pretty often asked why I'm not going to some other place that's actually less fascist. And contrary to what lots of Americans may imagine or may want to imagine, no, this is not the freest country on earth. Not by any measure you can come up with. Not socially, not economically, not in any way, pretty much. However, I'm staying here, and I thought I'd do a quick video about why. If you were the property of somebody else and you were actually their slave, but you had a choice of two slave masters and one would whip you harder than the other one, of course, if those were your only two options, it would make sense to wish to be owned by the master who whips you less. If, however, your goal is freedom and to not be a slave, then you may look at those different plantations and instead of saying, well, which is currently less sadistic towards me, you'd say, which is logistically easier to escape from, which gives me more of an opportunity to run away or bash the slave master over the head with a brick or something. Whatever it is, if your goal is not just the most tolerable level of injustice you can find, but actual justice instead, then your priorities change and your choices change. And when it comes to the goal of freedom, the reason I'm in the US and I'm not leaving is because based on what I've seen and what I've heard talking to lots and lots of other people who have been all over the world, which I haven't, but talking to lots of people who have, there is more of a spirit of resistance in the US than anywhere else. Now, it's not the majority of the people. There's plenty of people here who are not only very obedient and willing to be stomped on by their government, but they're actually voting for that. They're trying to make that happen. I'm not pretending the American people as a whole believe in freedom or even know what the hell it is, because most of them don't. But I am saying that the spirit of resistance is still alive here in a way that it isn't almost anywhere else in the world. And there are different levels of that. So let me start with the idea of protesting, because as you've probably seen, there have been protests in lots of countries, which usually consist of a bunch of people who are being mistreated and abused, going and doing a big display in front of the buildings inhabited by the political parasites who are abusing them, and saying, we don't like this, and we want you to do something different, and we don't like that you're doing that to us. Now, that's one level, that's sort of the lowest level there is of resistance, because it kind of isn't resistance. At least you're doing something, at least you're speaking out, at least you're saying this isn't okay, so all right, you get some credit for that. But all you're doing is telling your abuser that you don't like being abused. Were you under the impression that he thought you did like being abused? Do you actually think that the people in power give a damn about the protesters? Do you think the problem was that they just didn't know that people weren't going to like the authoritarian garbage they were doing? They already knew that. They knew that before they did it. They had no misconceptions about that, whatever. The only thing they care about is, are you going to go along with it? Are you going to put up with it? Are you going to keep paying tribute to them? Are you going to keep obeying them? And if you are, you can scream and whine and moan all you want, and they just don't care. And most protests are that, is going to a Capitol building somewhere and saying, we don't like what you're doing to us, and they don't freaking care. They're going to keep doing it to you. But again, at least that's something. At least that's some level of disobedience. And in a whole lot of countries, a lot of people have had that level of disobedience. That level of disobedience doesn't ever result in freedom. It doesn't ever result in the defeat of an authoritarian empire. Anywhere. Protesting doesn't do that. Sorry. So what's the next level up? Well, disobedience. Not just saying we don't like what you're doing, but we're not going to go along with it. We're not going to obey you. We're going to openly disobey. So then you get things like Gandhi, which is maybe the biggest example of civil disobedience in history, where he got a huge number of people in India to just ignore the dictates of the British Crown. Just go, no, we're gonna do this, and I know you told us we're not supposed to, and we just don't care. We're doing it anyway, and you can beat us up and throw us in cages, but we're gonna disobey. So that's another level, and that I have way more respect for than just protesting, just telling your abuser, I don't like being abused. Well, whoop-de-doo. He already knew you didn't like being abused. He doesn't care. That's why he's abusing you. But when you're saying, I'm not going along with your abuse, good, that's another step, and that's a big step. And just the mental ability to do that is kind of rare, as the Milgram experiments, the experiments done by Stanley Milgram, demonstrate that most people have a really hard time disobeying a perceived authority. They feel guilty, it makes them uneasy, and that's if they know they're doing the wrong thing. Even the act of doing something they know is right is difficult for most people if authority told them not to do it. To be able to say no to authority takes a lot of effort because people have been so indoctrinated and conditioned and trained and programmed to believe that obedience to authority is a virtue. So it does take a lot of strength for people to say, I'm just going to disobey. Now, there's two categories of disobeying you could break it down into. One is, I'm going to quietly disobey behind your back and hope you don't notice. Like, for a long time, a huge percentage of the population of the U.S. smoked pot, even though it was illegal in most places. And now that's changing. But a lot of people did it anyway. But they did it quietly and behind closed doors, and it wasn't a protest. They weren't coming out and saying, we're going to do this right in front of you because you have no right to tell us to do this. Now, there are some people who did that. In fact, I was at one of the events in Philadelphia where people were doing that. We're going to come smoke pot right in front of you. We're going to tell you ahead of time just to make you come and be thugs and hopefully showing the rest of the world how bogus and unjust and ridiculous the war on drugs is. So those two forms of disobedience, like doing it quietly in the background, hoping nobody notices, and doing it right in their face to openly say, we are not going to obey you. We don't feel an obligation to obey you. Those take different levels of courage, and they represent different things, because the people who say, well, I'm going to do it secretly, but oh, you caught me and now I'm going to prison and I'm going to go along with it and hang my head in shame at being caught, that's kind of pathetic, because what you're saying is, I acknowledge that I should have obeyed the master, I should have let him control and abuse me, and I'm bad for not doing that. And it's sad, but a lot of people do that. And when I was in prison for 15 months for not sending pieces of paper to the IRS, I saw a number of people in there who were in there for victimless crimes, and they would argue to me that they deserved it. And I was trying to tell them, no, you don't. If you were selling drugs to willing adult customers, it's not okay that they robbed you and caged you and locked you up. That's not okay. They had no moral justification to do that, regardless of what their law says. But you can see the conditioning in a lot of people that shows that when they disobey authority, they feel bad about it. And it's a very different, important step between disobeying when nobody's looking and feeling a little bit bad about it and guilty about it, and the people willing to go, no, when I disobey, I'm doing it in their face, and I'm telling them they're wrong and I'm right to disobey. And if they enforce anything on me for disobeying, they're in the wrong, they're the bad guy. And that is very difficult for a lot of people to do. To look at a supposed authority and say, you can condemn me all you want for disobeying your laws or whatever you're calling your stupid decrees, and I don't care. I feel no shame and no guilt. Like, you may still be able to force it on me, but I'm not going to give what Ayn Rand called the sanction of the victim. I'm not going to pretend that it's okay that you're doing this to me. I'm going to disobey and you're going to do what you're going to do, but I'm not going to pretend that I was the bad guy for disobeying you, because I'm not. That spirit is something that I believe is still stronger in the US than anywhere else in the world. The idea of saying, we're all the way going to disobey you on purpose, knowing that it's illegal, knowing that your laws say we're not allowed to, and we just don't care because in this case, whatever the exact situation is, we think your laws are bogus and we have no obligation to obey and you have no right to force this on us. That is a very unusual thing to happen. It's not like it's only happened in the US. It's happened in other places too. But as far as the number of people able to think and act that way, I think there are more people in the US than anywhere else. But there's one step left that I have to cover, and it's the real reason that I'm not leaving the US, if you want to boil it down to one thing. If somebody says your law is bogus, I'm going to disobey it, and then they allow themselves to be beat up and thrown in a cage or shot or whatever, that is one level of resistance, and that takes courage. And, those people are still way ahead of the curve. They're way ahead of most people as far as being able to actually make a difference. But there's an extra step that most of the world will cringe even thinking about, and even most Americans will cringe when thinking about, which is when a law is unjust and people disobey it and the thugs of the state come to enforce it, when do the people have the right to say, if you're going to escalate this to violence, we're going to match your escalation and we're going to resort to defensive force against you? And that has happened a few times in the US, sometimes with terrible results, sometimes with better results. And the ones with better results you don't get taught about very often. But the ability to not only say no, but to say, no, I'm not going to obey, and I'm not going to let you punish me for disobeying your bogus commands. I'm actually going to resist. As far as I can tell, that mentality is very unusual around the world. It's unusual in the US. It's not, most people are not capable of doing that, but the number of people who are, I think there's a bigger percentage in the US of people actually willing to say to the master, not only do I not like what you're doing, I'm not just protesting, not only am I willing to disobey, but I'm willing to disobey, and if you try to punish me for it, I'm willing to defend myself to stop you. That is the only thing that ends authoritarian empires. That's the only thing. Because if the people in power know that you'll complain and disobey and come out and go, I'm not doing what you say, but then they'll go along with it when you send out your thugs to beat them up and throw them in a cage for a few years, you're still no threat to their power. You're just something they can use to make an example of you so the other people go, whoa, I'm not going to do that. The only threat to their power is the people who at the end of the day still cling to their own judgment, their own perception of right and wrong over the dictates of authority. Because if you're of the child mentality that says, I'm not going to do as I'm told, but when I get punished, I'll feel bad and let them do it to me, you're not a grown-up yet, and you're no threat to those in power. It is only the people who at some point will draw that line and say, I'm not going along with this, and you're not going to force me to go along with this. And if you send men with guns to hurt me for not going along with your bogus commands, well, as it happens, I have guns too. And if you're going to make this into a battle of violence, that's what we're going to have. And the fact that so many people point to the US and go, look how many people have guns there. That's why I'm not leaving the US. Because here, at least some percentage of the population insists on retaining the mentality and the machinery so that at some point they can draw a line and say, you're not doing this to us. And we mean you're not doing this to us. We don't mean we're going to complain really loudly. We don't mean we're going to disobey and then let you beat us up for it. We mean we're going to disobey and you're going to let us disobey, or things are going to get really damn ugly. And the more you escalate it, the more we will escalate our defenses. That is the attitude that humanity needs, because anything short of that is not pro-freedom. Anything short of that is saying, well, we really, really want the permission of the masters to be free. We really, really, really want them to change their laws and legislate something that says we're allowed to do certain things. If at the end of the day, that is the extent to which you will resist, you're not even resisting, you're just begging. And there's a difference. So yes, while there are things about the U.S. that right now are worse than a lot of other places, especially on a practical day-to-day basis, there's lots of places you can go and live and have far fewer tentacles of government messing with your life. But here is where I still see the most people, in fact, particularly in Arizona, where I am now, where I see the most people who actually have the mental fortitude, not just to complain, not even just to disobey, but to disobey and then resist the enforcement of immoral laws. And a population not able to do that or not willing to do that is completely at the whim of psychopaths and megalomaniacs. You're just hoping that they don't choose to completely abuse you, but you won't really do anything to stop them if they try. The reason we haven't seen and aren't going to see the full, fascist, dystopian nightmare things that you see in lots of movies in the U.S. is not because of the people who vote, and it's not because of the people who protest. It's because the minority, the tiny minority of people who will actually forcibly defend themselves against forced authoritarian injustice. And that's why I'm not going anywhere.